What happens when the vows are said, the rings are exchanged, and the dream day suddenly transforms into a nightmare? What if the moment meant to symbolize forever becomes the moment everything falls apart? For one couple, the secret that surfaced on their wedding night didn't just break hearts, it changed lives forever, leaving one person dead and a trail of questions that still haunt those who were there. This is not just a story of love gone wrong, it's a story of betrayal, a web of secrets woven tightly until one thread unraveled it all. A groom, a bridesmaid, and a truth that was never meant to be revealed. But the truth has a way of coming out, sometimes in the most devastating way imaginable. We're looking deep into the shocking case of a wedding night that ended not in happily ever after, but in heartbreak and tragedy. What led to the ultimate betrayal? How did love turn into rage? And what truly happened in those final, harrowing moments? We'll uncover the secrets, the lies, and the deadly outcome of a night that was meant to be magical, but spiraled into chaos. It was a crisp autumn evening, October 12th, in the quiet town of Riverstone, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and life seems to move a little slower. The air was cool but not cold, the leaves a vibrant color of gold, orange, and red, as if nature itself was celebrating what was supposed to be the happiest day in the lives of 29-year-old Emily Carter and 31-year-old Mark Bennett. Emily and Mark were the couple everyone admired. High school sweethearts turned lifelong partners. Their story was the stuff of small-town fairy tales. Emily, a schoolteacher with a kind smile and an unshakable belief in the goodness of people, was adored by her students and loved deeply by her family. Mark, a local firefighter, was the town's hero, brave, hard-working, and dependable. Together, they seemed to embody the perfect union. A love story straight out of a romance novel. But every love story has its supporting cast, and in this one, it was Sophia Reynolds, Emily's best friend and bridesmaid. Sophia and Emily had been inseparable since college. A bond forged over late-night study sessions, shared heartbreaks, and dreams for the future. Sophia was the life of any party, the confidant Emily turned to in her happiest and darkest moments. She was family to Emily, and by extension, to Mark. The wedding was held at Willowcrest Manor, a charming estate with sweeping gardens and an elegant ballroom. It was the kind of venue couples dream of, where memories are meant to be made and cherished. Friends and family gathered early in the day, dressed in their finest attire, beaming with joy and anticipation. The ceremony was flawless. Mark and Emily exchanged vows under a canopy of twinkling lights as their loved ones looked on with tears in their eyes. From the outside, it seemed like everything was perfect. But perfect isn't always real. As the night unfolded, the laughter, the dancing, and the toasts began to mask something darker. Little did anyone know, hidden behind the smiles and the champagne toasts, there were secrets. Secrets that would unravel everything before the night was over. The bridal party glided through the reception, seemingly carefree. Emily, radiant in her white lace gown, danced with Mark, their hands intertwined, their eyes locked. Guests cheered as Sophia, in her elegant bridesmaid dress, toasted to the couple's future, her words heartfelt, her smile dazzling. It was a picture-perfect moment. But as they say, pictures don't always tell the full story. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, the fairy tale began to crack. Whispers started circulating among the guests, an overheard conversation here, a glance that lasted too long there. Something wasn't right. And soon, those whispers would turn into gasps. and the night would spiral into something no one could have imagined. At first, the night appeared to follow the script of a perfect wedding celebration. The champagne flowed freely, laughter echoed through the grand halls of Willowcrest Manor, and the dance floor stayed packed with family and friends celebrating the newlyweds. But as the evening wore on, something began to shift. There was a subtle change in the atmosphere, an unease that crept in like a shadow. It began innocuously enough. During a quiet moment, Emily stepped away from the reception to freshen up, leaving Mark and Sophia chatting by the bar. This wasn't unusual. After all, Sophia had been a trusted friend for years, someone Emily could always count on. But as the minutes ticked by, guests started to notice the intensity of their conversation. The way Mark leaned in closer, how Sophia's laughter seemed too intimate, and the way they quickly looked away when someone approached. It was subtle, but not invisible. One guest, a cousin of the bride, later admitted that they overheard snippets of their conversation. A hushed argument that ended with Sophia whispering, "You promised me this wouldn't happen tonight." The words were cryptic but loaded, raising immediate suspicion. The cousin brushed it off at first, thinking it was simply a misheard exchange. But that wasn't the only sign. Later that evening, during a lull in the festivities, Emily's younger sister Claire decided to check on her sibling. She found Emily in a side room, scrolling through her phone, her expression frozen in shock. A bridesmaid had casually handed her Mark's phone earlier, claiming he'd left it on the table, and curiosity got the better of Emily. What she found stopped her cold. There it was, a string of text messages between Mark and Sophia. Messages that spanned months, filled with intimate confessions, plans for secret rendezvous, and even photos. Undeniable proof of their affair. Emily's hands trembled as she read each word, her vision blurring with tears. This wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a knife in the back from two people she loved most. But it wasn't the messages alone that shattered Emily's world. It was the most recent one, sent just hours before the ceremony. "Are you sure you want to go through with this? It's not too late for us." Sophia's words, preserved in black and white, left no room for doubt. This wasn't a fleeting mistake. It was a calculated deception. Emily was devastated, but also furious. Her sister begged her to keep calm, to think about how she wanted to handle it. But Emily, always the one to face things head-on, couldn't wait. Clutching the phone, she stormed out of the room, her gown trailing behind her, a vision of heartbreak and determination. She found them near the garden, standing too close for comfort. Guests were nearby, but in that moment, Emily didn't care. She confronted Mark and Sophia directly, her voice trembling with rage. "How long?" she demanded, holding up the phone as evidence. Mark froze, his face draining of color, while Sophia stammered for an explanation. The guests nearby began to notice, their murmurs growing louder as they realized something serious was unfolding. It was a public spectacle. A bride in tears, a groom struggling to find words, and a bridesmaid caught in the glare of betrayal. But as explosive as this confrontation was, it was only the beginning. The revelations and raw emotions of that moment would set off a chain of events that no one could have anticipated. The truth was out, but the night's darkest moments were still to come. The garden for wedding photos became the stage for a scene no one could have anticipated. As Emily's voice rang out, trembling with fury and heartbreak, the joyous atmosphere of the wedding shattered like a dropped champagne glass. The music inside the ballroom faltered, and guests began to step outside, drawn by the commotion. What they saw left them stunned. At first, there was silence. the kind of silence that comes when people can't quite believe what they're hearing. Then, the whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Conversations halted mid-sentence as eyes turned toward the trio at the center of the storm. The bride, still clutching the damning evidence in her hand. The groom, pale and visibly shaken. And the bridesmaid, her face a mix of defiance and embarrassment. Some guests looked away, too uncomfortable to watch the unfolding drama. Others leaned in, trying to catch every word. A group of bridesmaids huddled together, whispering in disbelief. "Did you know about this?" one asked, her voice barely audible. "How could she do this to Emily?" another murmured, her eyes filling with tears. Emily's parents, seated at a nearby table, exchanged horrified glances before rushing toward their daughter, their faces etched with concern and confusion. Not everyone kept their composure. Emily's cousin, who had overheard the earlier conversation, couldn't contain herself. "You're disgusting!" she shouted, pointing at Mark and Sophia, her voice trembling with rage. A guest near the bar dropped their glass in shock, the sharp sound punctuating the growing chaos. Meanwhile, one of Mark's groomsmen attempted to intervene, stepping between the bride and groom in an effort to defuse the situation. "Let's talk about this somewhere private," he urged, but his words were drowned out by the escalating emotions. For the rest of the guests, the realization that this wasn't just a spat, but a full-blown scandal, left a bitter taste. What had started as a night of celebration had devolved into something out of a soap opera, a spectacle of betrayal laid bare for everyone to see. Some tried to console Emily, others stared in shock, and a few discreetly began to gather their things, sensing that the night was taking a turn for the worse. While the guests grappled with the unfolding chaos, Mark and Sophia were trapped in the spotlight, their secret affair exposed in the most public and humiliating way possible. The groom, once the picture of confidence and charm, now looked like a man caught in a web of his own making. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what had gone wrong. How had Emily found out? And why now, of all nights? Mark had convinced himself that he could compartmentalize his life, that he could marry Emily while maintaining a secret relationship with Sophia. In his mind, he had rationalized it all. Sophia was a mistake, he told himself, a temporary escape during a rough patch in his relationship with Emily. But as the months passed, that mistake became a tangled emotional affair, one he was too weak, or perhaps too selfish, to end. And then there was Sophia. To the guests, she was the villain of the story, a bridesmaid who had betrayed her closest friend. But in her own mind, the narrative was different. Sophia had convinced herself that Mark's feelings for Emily were waning, that their relationship was destined to fail. She believed that she and Mark had something real, something worth risking everything for. It was that belief that kept her in the affair, even as the wedding approached. She told herself that Mark would call it off, that he wouldn't go through with the marriage. But when he did, she swallowed her hurt and stood by Emily's side, her smile masking the bitterness inside. Neither Mark nor Sophia expected their secret to come out that night. They had been careful, or so they thought. The stolen glances, the hushed conversations, the late-night texts. They believed they had kept it hidden. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially in moments when the stakes are at their highest. And when Emily confronted them, they had no plan, no excuse prepared for the flood of questions and accusations. In the moments after the confrontation, Mark and Sophia were forced to face the fallout of their actions. Mark tried to speak, stumbling over his words as he attempted to apologize, to explain. But what could he say? No excuse would ever undo the pain he had caused. Sophia, on the other hand, stood frozen, her usual confidence replaced by a look of panic. She had always been quick with words, but in that moment, there was nothing to say. They had both made choices they couldn't take back, choices that had led to this very moment. A moment where trust was shattered, lives were upended, and the night spiraled toward a conclusion far darker than anyone could have anticipated. The night was no longer about celebration. It was no longer about vows or promises. It was now about raw emotion, betrayal, and an inevitable breaking point. Emily stood there, her hands trembling, still holding Mark's phone, the messages burning a hole in her soul. The faces of the guests around her blurred, their whispers a constant buzz in the background. But none of it mattered. She had been betrayed by the one person who had vowed to love her forever, and the woman she trusted most in the world. In that moment, everything Emily thought she knew about love, trust, and friendship crumbled to the ground. It wasn't just the affair that shattered her. It was the realization that the two people closest to her had conspired against her, hiding behind lies and deceit. What made the betrayal even more painful was the fact that this wasn't just a mistake. It was calculated, planned, and executed with precision. They thought they could get away with it, but now the truth had come crashing down in the most public of ways. Emily's chest heaved with emotion. Her voice was steady at first, but as she spoke, the tremor of heartbreak was unmistakable. "How could you do this to me, Mark? How could you betray me like this?" Her eyes locked onto him, and for the briefest moment, Mark saw the person he had once promised to cherish forever. The woman he loved, the woman who was now standing before him, broken. His response was a choked whisper. "Emily, I never meant for you to find out like this." The words, empty and hollow, fell flat between them. But Emily wasn't done. Her pain surged into anger, a fire that burned through her heartbreak. "You never meant for me to find out? That's your excuse?" she spat. "You think I wouldn't have noticed? You think I wouldn't have felt the distance between us? And you, Sophia, how could you? You were supposed to be my best friend." Her voice cracked as the dam of emotion broke completely. For a moment, she seemed to lose herself entirely. The weight of the years of trust and love she had given both of them crashing down on her all at once. The guests watched in stunned silence, some too uncomfortable to even look at the unfolding chaos, while others exchanged uneasy glances. But this wasn't just a moment of emotional release. It was the moment where things would no longer be able to be undone. It wasn't just about the words that were spoken. It was about what happened next. Suddenly, without warning, Emily collapsed to her knees. The emotions of the day, the betrayal, and the heartbreak overcame her in an instant. Her tears fell freely, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though she would never stop crying. The onlookers rushed to her side, but it wasn't just the emotional toll that had taken her down. Something was wrong. Sophia, who had been standing nearby, watched as Emily's meltdown intensified. Her own feelings of guilt, fear, and shame mixed with an instinctive self-preservation. In a panic, Sophia tried to approach Emily, but instead of offering comfort, she merely distanced herself further, perhaps too overwhelmed by her own guilt, or perhaps afraid of how Emily might lash out. Then, something unexpected happened. As Mark stepped forward to try to calm Emily down, to apologize, to fix the mess he had created, Emily's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. In a moment of blind rage, she screamed, "Don't you dare touch me!" Her voice, a mix of heartbreak and fury, echoed through the garden, a chilling cry that made even the most stoic guests take a step back. In the heat of the confrontation, Mark, feeling cornered and desperate, raised his voice for the first time, his words harsh and defensive. "I made a mistake, Emily. I didn't want this to happen. Sophia and I. It wasn't supposed to go this far," he shouted, his voice breaking. The confession hung in the air, but it was too little, too late. Then, in the midst of the chaos, something shifted in Emily's eyes. What had started as a flurry of emotions, hurt, disbelief, and confusion, was now replaced by a sharp, dangerous calm. In an instant, she pushed Mark away, stood up, and looked him dead in the eyes. "I trusted you," she whispered, her voice quiet, yet somehow louder than the screams moments before. She stepped back, and with an eerie calmness, she made her way toward the exit of the garden, the sound of her heels echoing in the silence left behind. The tension was unbearable, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of impending doom. As Emily reached the garden's edge, she stopped, turning her head slowly over her shoulder. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, in one final act of shocking defiance, Emily spoke her last words. "You'll regret this," she said, her tone cold, calculated, more chilling than anything she had said before. And then, as she walked away from the man who had betrayed her, from the life they had planned, she vanished into the night. What no one could have expected, however, was that the night wasn't over. Emily's final words lingered in the air, but what happened next would send shockwaves through the wedding party, and through everyone who would later hear the tale. As Emily made her way to the back of the estate, something went terribly wrong, something dark, something deadly. And the guests, still frozen in the aftermath of the confrontation, had no idea how close they were to witnessing a tragedy unfold before their eyes. With Emily's chilling words hanging in the air, the guests stood frozen in place, too stunned to speak. They didn't know what was coming, couldn't have imagined the horrifying twist that would follow. But as Emily walked away from the confrontation, disappearing into the night, the tension that had simmered all evening would soon reach a devastating climax. At first, it seemed like Emily was simply leaving the scene, retreating into the night to escape the chaos. Some guests assumed she needed a moment to collect herself, to process the betrayal. But, as the minutes ticked by, an unsettling silence filled the garden. The music from inside the reception hall seemed distant now, muffled by the weight of the moment. And that's when the first hint of real danger emerged. Mark, still reeling from the confrontation, finally snapped out of his stupor and started to make his way toward Emily, hoping to apologize once again, to make things right somehow. He was desperate, torn between the woman he had loved and the woman he had betrayed. But as he turned the corner of the garden, he froze. What he saw left him paralyzed. Emily was standing near the edge of the estate, her back to him. She was gazing out into the darkened woods that bordered the property, her figure a silhouette against the moonlight. She hadn't heard him approach. At least, that's what Mark thought at first. But when he called her name, the coldness in her voice sent a chill down his spine. "Emily," he called softly, stepping closer. But before he could reach her, Emily turned sharply, her face expressionless, almost blank. And that's when he noticed it, her hands, trembling as they gripped the wrought iron railing that led down to the lower garden path. Her knuckles were white, her body swaying ever so slightly. It was as though she were standing on the edge of something much more dangerous than just the balcony. For a brief moment, everything seemed suspended in time, as if the universe was holding its breath. Mark could barely move, his heart pounding in his chest as he called out to her once more. But it was too late. Before he could react, before he could reach out and pull her back, Emily turned away from him and took one last step towards the darkness below. There was no scream, no warning, only the faintest sound of footsteps on gravel as she moved further away. And then, nothing. The quiet that followed was absolute. The guests inside the hall, still oblivious to the disaster unfolding just outside, continued their conversations, unaware of the nightmare that was taking place just beyond the garden walls. It wasn't until a few moments later that the first person heard something, a muffled thud, followed by a distant cry. Someone in the crowd, likely a guest who had stepped outside for some air, heard it clearly and rushed to the garden to investigate. But by then, it was already too late. Mark was the first to reach her. He arrived at the spot where Emily had fallen. The sight was a nightmare. She lay motionless on the ground, the only sign of life being the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Mark dropped to his knees beside her, his heart racing. He frantically tried to rouse her, but the blood staining her dress told him everything he needed to know. Something had gone horribly wrong. What had seemed like a desperate act of emotional escape had turned into something far worse. Emily had fallen, but not just from the balcony. She had fallen into the cruel embrace of fate. Her injuries were grave, fatal even, and her body lay twisted, broken, a tragic symbol of the events that had spiraled out of control. It was the groom's worst nightmare come true. The woman he had betrayed, the woman he had promised to love, was now lying at the edge of life and death. And it was all because of him, because of the lies, the affair, the heartbreak that had shattered her to her core. As paramedics rushed to the scene, the realization of what had just happened began to settle in. Emily was still alive, but just barely. There was hope, though it seemed thin, like a candle flickering in a storm. But as the paramedics worked, something else began to stir, something far darker than anyone could have imagined. As the paramedics worked desperately to stabilize Emily, the reality of the situation began to sink in. What had started as a wedding night of joy had turned into a scene of horror. The authorities were quickly called to the scene, with police officers arriving on site not long after Emily had been rushed to the hospital. The police began their preliminary investigation by securing the wedding venue. The garden area, where Emily had fallen, was cordoned off, and the guests were questioned. Many were still in shock, unable to fully comprehend what had just transpired. At first, it appeared to be a tragic accident, a spur-of-the-moment decision driven by emotional turmoil. But as the officers began piecing together the timeline of events leading up to the fall, something didn't quite add up. One of the first things they noticed was that Emily's fall wasn't consistent with someone who had simply lost their balance or wandered aimlessly to the edge. The position of her body, the absence of any attempt to break her fall, these were troubling signs. Forensics took over the scene, and they began to examine the surrounding area for any signs of foul play. At first, the evidence seemed to suggest the worst. Emily had fallen. But the more they delved into the details, the more they realized there was a deeper story behind the tragedy. Witness statements from guests who had been in the vicinity of the garden at the time of the fall were inconsistent. Some claimed to have heard an argument just moments before Emily's fall, while others mentioned hearing nothing at all. It wasn't until a few days later that one key witness came forward, a young man who had been standing at the garden's edge and had witnessed something that would change everything. He claimed to have seen someone near Emily just before the fall, someone who appeared to be pushing her. At first, the witness was unsure. After all, it was dark, and emotions were running high. But upon further questioning, he was adamant. He had seen a figure, a silhouette in the darkness, near Emily when she fell. The figure had been too close. It was someone from the wedding party, someone who had been there all along, pretending to be just as shocked as the rest. With this new information, the police began to focus on the people closest to Emily: Mark and Sophia. Mark, the groom, was immediately questioned, but his reaction was one of stunned disbelief. He denied any involvement in pushing Emily, claiming that when she left the reception, he had been too distraught to follow her right away. He insisted that when he reached the garden, Emily had already fallen, and he hadn't seen anyone else around. But the investigation soon uncovered something disturbing. A few of the wedding guests recalled seeing Sophia and Mark exchange whispered words just moments before Emily walked away from the confrontation. These interactions seemed innocent at first, but now took on a more sinister context. Was there a plan in motion that no one had noticed until it was too late? Was this tragedy something more than a simple act of heartbreak? Sophia was brought in for questioning next. As the bridesmaid, she had been the center of suspicion from the very beginning. Her close relationship with the groom, her seeming discomfort when the affair was exposed, and her proximity to Emily just before the fall all pointed to her as someone who might have known more than she let on. When she was questioned, her story remained remarkably consistent. She had been devastated by the confrontation between Emily and Mark and had tried to offer comfort. But what she didn't say immediately was that, in the chaos of the evening, she had seen something that made her reconsider her involvement in the evening's events. Despite their denials, the investigation grew more complicated. Forensic evidence from the scene was analyzed: blood spatter patterns, fingerprints, and traces of physical struggle. And what was uncovered only deepened the mystery. Though there were no definitive signs of a physical altercation before the fall, the evidence revealed something troubling. Emily's handprints were found smeared on the wrought iron railing, suggesting she had tried to stop herself from falling, but had been unable to. Was she pushed, or had she simply lost her grip in the heat of the moment? With mounting suspicion, the authorities began to look closer at the psychological motives of the individuals involved. Was it jealousy, anger, or something darker? Was the affair a catalyst for violence, or had something more sinister been brewing beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic wedding day? As the investigation unfolded, the motive behind Emily's fall came into sharper focus. It wasn't just an act of jealousy or betrayal. It was a complex web of emotions and desires fueled by years of unresolved tension between the three main players: Mark, Sophia, and Emily. Mark, the groom, was clearly torn. On the one hand, he had promised Emily his love and loyalty. On the other hand, the affair with Sophia had been a secret he had tried desperately to keep hidden. But what truly motivated him to betray his bride wasn't just a fleeting attraction. It was a long-standing relationship with Sophia, one that had been much more than just a momentary lapse in judgment. There had been something deeper between them, something that had festered beneath the surface for years. And then there was Sophia, the bridesmaid, the third piece of this tragic puzzle. Sophia had been Emily's closest friend, the one person who could do no wrong in her eyes. But that trust had been shattered, and her own feelings of guilt and desperation began to surface. As the affair was exposed, Sophia was torn between her loyalty to Mark, whom she had been involved with for so long, and her own sense of shame for betraying Emily in the most intimate of ways. It was this internal conflict that had led her to act in ways no one had expected. Was it jealousy, guilt, or something else that ultimately led to Emily's tragic fall? The authorities would soon discover that the events of that night were far more deliberate than anyone had imagined. But the question remained: who was responsible for the final, deadly push? And how much of the tragedy had been premeditated? The aftermath of Emily's death was devastating, not just for the bride's family, but for all those involved in the wedding. Emily's parents, who had watched their daughter marry the man she had trusted with her life, were crushed by the double betrayal, not just by Mark, but by Sophia as well. They struggled to understand how a day that was supposed to be filled with joy and celebration could end in such a tragic loss. For Mark's family, the fallout was just as painful, albeit in a different way. They had raised a son they believed to be a good man, one who could be trusted. Now, they had to come to terms with the fact that he had not only betrayed his wife, but had been complicit in a tragedy that had torn their entire family apart. The guilt that Mark felt was immeasurable, but the consequences of his actions, actions that no apology could ever erase, were only just beginning to unfold. And for Sophia, the pain was uniquely her own. Her life, once filled with dreams of friendship, love, and happiness, was now a wreckage of broken relationships and shattered trust. She had lost everything: her best friend, her place in the wedding party, her standing in the eyes of the community. She would never be able to escape the shadow of her role in Emily's death. As the months passed, the investigation drew to a close. Both Mark and Sophia were arrested. The charges were severe: manslaughter for Mark, who was accused of indirectly causing Emily's death through his betrayal and emotional manipulation. Sophia was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, her involvement in the planning of the event leading to Emily's fall becoming clearer with each new piece of evidence that emerged. The trial was a media sensation. The courtroom was packed with spectators, eager to see how the justice system would handle such a high-profile case. The prosecution argued that the affair had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately led to Emily's death. They pointed to the evidence: Sophia's whispered conversations with Mark, her nervous behavior after the confrontation, and the final moments before Emily's fall as proof of a premeditated act. But the defense team argued that there was no direct evidence linking Sophia to the fall. They insisted that Emily's actions were her own, that the tragic death was a result of emotional instability and not foul play. The defense also painted Mark as a deeply remorseful man who had not intended for any of this to happen. In the end, the jury deliberated for days, and the verdict was delivered. Mark was convicted of manslaughter, but Sophia was acquitted of any charges related to the fall. The court ruled that while her actions had been morally reprehensible, there was insufficient evidence to prove she had played a direct role in Emily's death. Emily's family was left with a bittersweet sense of justice. The man they had once welcomed into their lives was now behind bars, but it couldn't bring their daughter back. The resolution, though legally significant, did nothing to heal the wounds left behind. Even today, the questions linger. Was this truly a moment of jealousy gone too far? Or was there a deeper, more insidious motive at play? The world may never know the full truth behind the tragedy of that wedding night. But one thing is certain: lives were lost, families were torn apart, and the consequences of betrayal can sometimes be more deadly than anyone could ever imagine. As we reach the end of this harrowing journey, it's important to pause and reflect, not just on the events that unfolded, but on the lives that were irrevocably changed. Emily was not just a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a woman who had been filled with hope and love on the day that should have been the happiest of her life. The loss of her that night wasn't just the end of a wedding day, it was the end of a future she had envisioned. A future filled with dreams of marriage, children, and growing old with the man she had thought would be her partner in everything. Her parents, too, were forever altered by the tragedy. They had witnessed the joy in their daughter's eyes as she walked down the aisle, filled with hope and excitement for the life ahead. To see that hope dashed in such a violent and senseless manner was a pain they could never fully recover from. Their grief went beyond just the loss of their daughter. It was the destruction of all the love, dreams, and promises that Emily had carried with her. They now had to grapple with not only the brutality of her death, but with the betrayal she had suffered at the hands of those she loved most. The same could be said for Mark's family. They had watched their son grow up, always hoping that he would one day find true love and happiness. To see him fall so far, to be responsible for causing such irreparable damage to not only his marriage, but to his own future, was something they would never understand. The man they thought they knew had become a stranger, someone capable of betrayal so profound it led to the destruction of everything he had once held dear. And then there was Sophia, the bridesmaid, the woman who had once been Emily's closest friend, the one person she had trusted beyond all others. Sophia's grief was uniquely different, tinged with guilt and regret. She had once seen herself as the loyal friend, the one who stood beside Emily through thick and thin. But that loyalty had been shattered by her own actions, by the affair, by the deceit, and by the role she ultimately played in Emily's death. Sophia's emotional burden was heavier than anyone could have imagined. Yes, she had lost her best friend in the most tragic of ways, but she had also lost herself. The person she had once been, full of love and laughter, was gone, replaced by someone consumed with shame and regret. Could she ever heal from the knowledge that her actions had contributed to the untimely death of a woman who had once been like a sister to her? At the heart of this story lies one fundamental question: how much is too much to bear in the name of love? Was Sophia's betrayal of Emily justifiable by the love she had for Mark? Was it worth the destruction of everything they had, including their own futures? And most heartbreaking of all, could anyone truly grasp the depth of Emily's pain as she stood on the edge that fateful night, facing the most devastating betrayal she could ever imagine?